People love asking this question in whispers. Do Muslim women cheat? Not because they want the truth, but because they want confirmation of a bias. Today, we're not here to sensationalize, shame, or defend blindly. We're here to think, to challenge lazy narratives, and to talk about what no one wants to admit. Cheating isn't about religion, it's about human psychology. So let's have the uncomfortable conversation properly. Cheating is a human behavior, not a religious gender trait. And the moment we attach it to a faith or a gender, we stop thinking and start projecting. Infidelity has existed in every culture, every religion, every socio-economic class, and every historical period, long before modern debates or social media narratives tried to pin it on one group. It is not born from belief systems. It emerges from psychological patterns, unmet needs, poor communication, emotional immaturity, entitlement, fear of confrontation, or the inability to tolerate dissatisfaction. When people ask whether a specific group cheats more, what they are really doing is avoiding the harder question: why do humans betray trust at all? Religion may provide moral guidelines, but morality alone does not regulate emotional awareness, impulse control, or relationship skills. A person can pray, fast, and follow rituals while still being emotionally disconnected, resentful, or internally conflicted. Cheating often happens not in the absence of values, but in the presence of unresolved inner contradictions, where outward discipline exists without inward clarity. Reducing cheating to religion or gender is also intellectually dishonest because it ignores power dynamics, cultural pressure, and emotional suppression. Many individuals grow up learning obedience before self-expression, endurance before communication, and silence before honesty. When emotions are consistently invalidated or needs are framed as shameful, people don't stop having those needs. They simply stop expressing them openly. This creates a split between who they are allowed to be and who they actually are. Over time, this internal divide can manifest as secrecy, emotional affairs, or physical betrayal, not because faith failed, but because self-awareness was never cultivated. Cheating is rarely about desire alone. It is often about feeling seen, chosen, or temporarily relieved from a life where authenticity feels unsafe. To label this behavior as a flaw of religion or womanhood is to misunderstand the psychological mechanics behind it and to absolve individuals and societies of responsibility for creating emotionally illiterate environments. There is also a convenient hypocrisy in these conversations, where morality is weaponized selectively. When men cheat, explanations are offered: biology, temptation, loneliness, stress. Yet when women cheat, identity becomes the indictment. This inconsistency exposes the real motive behind such questions: control rather than understanding. Cheating is not proof of moral inferiority. It is evidence of poor coping strategies and broken relational systems. Accountability still exists, but accountability requires precision, not generalization. If faith alone prevented betrayal, no religious marriages would ever collapse, no spiritual leaders would ever fall, and no deeply moral households would experience infidelity. The truth is that human beings are complex, contradictory, and often poorly equipped to navigate intimacy. Cheating thrives where communication is unsafe, emotional needs are dismissed, and honesty is punished. And until conversations move away from blaming identities and toward examining relational health, emotional education, and personal responsibility, the same questions will keep being asked with the same misplaced assumptions, the same defensiveness, and the same refusal to look inward. Needs. Suppression does not eliminate desire, frustration, or longing. It only pushes them underground, where they grow without supervision. A relationship built on suppression may look functional, even respectable, but beneath that structure lies a quiet erosion of intimacy because connection cannot survive where honesty is consistently postponed. Self awareness disrupts this pattern because it refuses to let emotions remain vague or unexamined. A self aware individual notices dissatisfaction early before it mutates into bitterness or escapism. They ask difficult internal questions. Why am I unhappy? What am I avoiding saying? What am I expecting my partner to read without me expressing it? This process is uncomfortable because it removes the illusion of victimhood and replaces it with responsibility. In suppressed dynamics, people often believe they are being selfless, when in reality, they are being self abandoning. They trade short term peace for long term disconnection, convincing themselves that their needs are unreasonable or that wanting more emotional presence is a personal flaw. Self awareness challenges these narratives by making it clear that unspoken expectations are still expectations, and unmet needs do not disappear simply because they are ignored. When individuals lack this awareness, relationships become transactional rather than intimate, maintained through duty rather than emotional engagement. The danger of suppression in relationships is that it creates a delayed reaction rather than a resolved one. When feelings are not acknowledged in real time, they resurface later in distorted forms: emotional withdrawal, passive aggression, sudden detachment, or secret attachments outside the relationship. These behaviors often shock partners because the suppressed individual appeared fine for years. In reality, they were never fine, they were simply trained not to speak. Self awareness acts as a preventative force, allowing discomfort to be addressed when it is still manageable. It encourages honest dialogue, even at the risk of conflict, recognizing that respectful tension is healthier than silent decay. Relationships that foster self awareness make space for emotional negotiation rather than emotional sacrifice, where both partners are allowed to evolve without fear of punishment for change. Suppression is often rewarded socially, while self awareness is misinterpreted as selfishness or emotional excess. People who voice their needs are labeled difficult, dramatic, or ungrateful, while those who endure quietly are praised for loyalty and patience. This social reinforcement keeps unhealthy dynamics intact, particularly in long term relationships where roles become rigid and emotional growth is discouraged. Self awareness threatens these systems because it introduces movement, re-evaluation, and boundaries. It asks both partners to remain psychologically present rather than relying on habit and obligation. Without self awareness, relationships survive on inertia. With it, they require continuous emotional participation. The difference is not subtle. One preserves structure at the cost of connection, the other preserves connection even if structure must be renegotiated. Emotional neglect functions as a silent trigger because it rarely announces itself through obvious conflict or dramatic events. It operates quietly, through absence rather than presence, through what is missing rather than what is done wrong. In relationships, emotional neglect shows up when feelings are consistently minimized, when conversations remain practical but never personal, when one partner is physically present yet psychologically unavailable. There may be loyalty, routine, and responsibility, but little curiosity, reassurance, or emotional attunement. Over time, this absence communicates a powerful message. Your inner world does not matter enough to be explored. Unlike overt abuse, emotional neglect is difficult to name, which makes it even more damaging. People often question their own perceptions, telling themselves they are overreacting or asking for too much, and this self-doubt allows the neglect to persist unchecked. The human psyche does not respond well to prolonged emotional invisibility. When feelings are repeatedly ignored or unmet, the nervous system adapts by lowering expectations or seeking fulfillment elsewhere, sometimes unconsciously. Emotional neglect does not immediately lead to betrayal or detachment. It first creates loneliness within connection. A person can be in a committed relationship and still feel profoundly alone because intimacy is not defined by proximity but by emotional responsiveness. When attempts to connect are met with indifference, dismissal, or distraction, the neglected partner may stop reaching out altogether. This withdrawal is often misinterpreted as contentment or low maintenance, when in reality it is resignation. The relationship continues, but the emotional bond weakens, replaced by parallel lives rather than shared emotional space. What makes emotional neglect a powerful trigger is its cumulative nature. One missed conversation may not matter, but years of unmet emotional bids reshape how a person views themselves and their relationship. They may begin to internalize the neglect, believing they are uninteresting, unlovable, or burdensome. This internal narrative increases vulnerability to external validation because attention from someone else feels not just flattering, but reparative. It temporarily fills a void that has been ignored for too long. This does not mean neglect justifies harmful choices, but it explains why people sometimes make decisions that contradict their stated values. When emotional needs are chronically unmet, the psyche seeks relief, and without awareness, that relief can come from places that destabilize the relationship further. Emotional neglect is often unintentional, which makes accountability complex. Many individuals neglect emotionally because they were never taught how to engage emotionally themselves. They may provide materially, fulfill roles, and avoid overt conflict, believing this is what commitment looks like. Yet relationships require more than stability. They require emotional presence, curiosity, and responsiveness. Without these, trust erodes quietly, not through betrayal, but through indifference. The neglected partner may eventually stop expressing needs altogether, creating the illusion that everything is fine while emotional distance solidifies. By the time consequences appear, they seem sudden, even though the neglect has been ongoing for years. The most damaging aspect of emotional neglect is that it numbs rather than explodes. There may be no fights, no ultimatums, no visible breakdown, just a gradual loss of emotional investment. This numbness is often mistaken for maturity or patience, but it is actually a form of disengagement. When people feel emotionally unseen for too long, they either leave physically or leave emotionally while staying. Emotional neglect does not scream for attention. It waits patiently until the relationship is hollow enough that even small outside connections feel intensely significant. The difference between moral values and unmet needs is often misunderstood, yet it sits at the core of many relational conflicts and personal contradictions. Moral values are internalized belief systems about right and wrong, shaped by culture, upbringing, faith, and social reinforcement. They guide how people want to see themselves and how they wish to be perceived by others. Unmet needs, however, operate on a different psychological level. They are not ideological, they are emotional, relational, and often unconscious. Needs revolve around connection, validation, safety, intimacy, appreciation, and belonging. A person can hold strong moral values while simultaneously carrying unmet needs, and the presence of one does not automatically cancel out the pressure created by the other. This is where internal tension begins, when who someone believes they should be conflicts with what they are emotionally lacking. Many people assume that strong morals are enough to regulate behavior, but morals are aspirational frameworks, not emotional regulators. They tell a person what they ought to do, not how to cope when something essential is missing. Unmet needs do not disappear because someone believes in loyalty, patience, or commitment. They remain active, influencing mood, perception, and decision-making. When these needs are ignored for long periods, they do not politely wait. They begin to express themselves indirectly through irritability, withdrawal, fantasy, or emotional dependence on external validation. This does not mean values are fake or meaningless. It means values require supportive conditions to be lived out sustainably. Without emotional nourishment, values become heavy expectations rather than guiding principles. The danger lies in moralizing emotional deprivation instead of addressing it. People are often encouraged to endure dissatisfaction in the name of virtue, confusing self-denial with strength. They may silence themselves, believing that wanting more attention, affection, or understanding makes them weak or ungrateful. Over time, this creates a fractured inner world where the moral identity remains intact on the surface, while emotional needs operate underground. This split increases the likelihood of internal rationalization, where individuals justify small emotional escapes because they feel morally constrained yet emotionally starved. The conflict is not between right and wrong, but between suppression and survival. When needs are unmet long enough, the psyche prioritizes relief, even if it contradicts stated values. Unmet needs also distort perception. A person who feels unseen or unappreciated may begin to interpret neutral behavior as rejection or indifference, intensifying emotional hunger. In this state, external attention feels disproportionately powerful, not because the person lacks morals, but because their emotional reserves are depleted. Moral values are stable only when the individual feels emotionally grounded. When someone is chronically deprived, values become ideals rather than lived realities. This explains why people are often shocked by their own behavior, insisting they acted out of character, when in fact they acted out of unacknowledged need. Understanding the difference between moral values and unmet needs requires abandoning simplistic judgments. It requires recognizing that ethical behavior is not sustained by willpower alone, but by emotional health, open communication, and environments where needs can be expressed without shame. Values thrive when needs are acknowledged early and addressed responsibly. When they are ignored, values become brittle, easily fractured under emotional pressure, and the individual is left struggling to reconcile who they believe they are with what they feel they are missing. Cultural pressure, shame, and double standards operate together as an invisible framework that shapes behavior while rarely being questioned. Cultural pressure dictates what is acceptable, respectable, and worthy of approval, often prioritizing appearance over authenticity. Individuals learn early that belonging is conditional, earned by compliance rather than honesty. Shame becomes the primary enforcement tool, signaling that deviation from prescribed roles threatens social standing, family honor, or moral worth. Under this system, people are trained to manage perception instead of emotions, to conceal struggle instead of resolving it. The result is a culture where problems are not addressed but hidden, and where maintaining an image of propriety takes precedence over psychological well-being. Shame thrives in environments where open dialogue is discouraged and vulnerability is equated with weakness. Rather than being used as a corrective emotion that guides ethical behavior, shame becomes a mechanism of control. People internalize the belief that certain thoughts, desires, or dissatisfactions are unacceptable, even if they are natural human experiences. This internalization leads to self-surveillance, where individuals monitor their own feelings and suppress anything that might invite judgment. Over time, this creates emotional isolation as people feel unable to express their true experiences without risking humiliation or rejection. The fear of being exposed becomes stronger than the desire to be understood, and silence is mistaken for moral strength. Double standards intensify this dynamic by applying rules unevenly, often based on gender or social status. Certain behaviors are excused, rationalized, or even normalized for one group, while being harshly condemned in another. This inconsistency sends a clear message about whose experiences matter and whose do not. When accountability is selective, morality becomes less about ethics and more about power. Individuals on the receiving end of stricter judgment learn that fairness is not guaranteed, which fosters resentment and confusion. They are expected to uphold ideals without being afforded the same emotional latitude or understanding granted to others. This imbalance erodes trust, not only in relationships, but in the moral systems themselves. Living under constant cultural pressure distorts self-concept. People begin to define themselves by how well they perform roles, rather than how authentically they live. Shame discourages self-reflection because looking inward risks uncovering feelings that are socially unacceptable. Double standards discourage speaking out because the consequences are uneven and often severe. Together, these forces create environments where emotional needs are ignored, boundaries are unclear, and resentment quietly accumulates. People may comply outwardly while disengaging inwardly, learning to survive rather than connect. This internal withdrawal often goes unnoticed until it manifests in behavior that seems sudden or inexplicable to outsiders. The most damaging aspect of cultural pressure, shame, and double standards is how effectively they silence accountability at a systemic level. By framing individual suffering as personal failure rather than structural imbalance, cultures avoid examining the rules that create distress. Shame keeps people focused on self-blame, while double standards ensure that those with privilege remain unchallenged. This prevents meaningful change and reinforces cycles of repression. When emotional truth is punished and image management is rewarded, authenticity becomes risky and growth becomes stagnant. People are left navigating conflicting expectations without the tools to reconcile them, carrying the weight of conformity while longing for understanding and fairness. Accountability without demonization requires a level of emotional and intellectual maturity that many conversations never reach. Accountability is about recognizing choices, impact, and responsibility, while demonization is about reducing a person to their worst behavior and stripping away context, complexity, and humanity. The two are often confused because demonization feels morally satisfying. It creates a clear villain and offers emotional release without requiring deeper understanding. Accountability, by contrast, is uncomfortable because it demands precision. It asks not only what happened, but why it happened, how patterns formed, and what conditions allowed those choices to feel possible. Holding someone accountable does not require moral annihilation. It requires clarity, boundaries, and a refusal to excuse harm while still acknowledging that behavior does not exist in a vacuum. When demonization replaces accountability, growth becomes impossible. Labeling someone as immoral, broken, or inherently flawed shuts down reflection and encourages defensiveness rather than responsibility. People who are attacked at the level of identity focus on self-protection, not self-examination. True accountability invites ownership by separating the behavior from the person, making it possible to say, "This action was harmful," without declaring, "You are beyond repair." Demonization simplifies complex human behavior into good versus evil, ignoring psychological factors such as emotional deprivation, learned patterns, fear, or lack of self-awareness. This simplification may satisfy public outrage, but it does nothing to prevent repetition because it fails to address the underlying mechanisms that drive behavior in the first place. Accountability without demonization also challenges collective hypocrisy. Societies often demand harsh accountability from those with less power while offering nuance and forgiveness to those with more. This inconsistency reveals that outrage is frequently less about ethics and more about control. Genuine accountability applies standards evenly and focuses on repair rather than punishment alone. It asks what boundaries were crossed, what trust was broken, and what must change to prevent recurrence. It does not rush to erase a person's entire moral worth based on one failure, nor does it confuse understanding with endorsement. Understanding is a tool for prevention, not a justification for harm, and refusing to understand does not make harm less likely to happen again. The refusal to demonize does not mean avoiding consequences. Accountability involves consequences that are proportionate, intentional, and aimed at correction rather than humiliation. It requires emotional honesty from all sides. The person who caused harm must confront their choices without minimizing them, and those affected must be allowed to name their pain without being accused of cruelty or intolerance. This balance is difficult because it resists extremes, and extremes are easier to sell. Demonization offers certainty and moral superiority. Accountability demands patience, discernment, and the willingness to sit with discomfort. It recognizes that people are capable of harmful actions and meaningful change at the same time, that responsibility and complexity can coexist, and that lasting ethical behavior is cultivated through awareness, not fear, through understanding, not erasure, through systems that prioritize repair over spectacle and truth over emotional convenience. When all of this is stripped down, religion, gender, culture, morality, the pattern becomes clear. Human behavior cannot be understood through labels alone. Cheating, silence, resentment, and withdrawal do not emerge out of nowhere, nor do they belong to one group more than another. They grow in environments where self-awareness is discouraged, emotional needs are neglected, shame replaces dialogue, and double standards distort accountability. Moral values matter, but they cannot survive in isolation from emotional health. Suppression may maintain order for a while, but it quietly erodes connection, and emotional neglect does not scream, it waits. When people are denied the language to understand themselves, they act out what they were never allowed to speak. The real work, then, is not in defending identities or attacking them, but in building relationships and cultures that can tolerate honesty without humiliation and accountability without dehumanization. Responsibility must exist without turning people into monsters, and understanding must exist without excusing harm. When conversations move away from blame and toward psychological clarity, the focus shifts from who to condemn to what must change. That shift is uncomfortable because it removes easy answers and forces deeper reflection, but it is the only way trust, integrity, and genuine commitment can exist without fear, silence, or self-betrayal.